Welcome to ¿Qué pasa? HSIs, a podcast dedicated to everything Hispanic serving institutions. I'm your host, Dr. Gina Ann Garcia, bringing you the news on what's happening in HSIs. Join us as we explore the history and evolution of HSIs, culturally relevant and liberatory practices, current and emerging research with HSIs, and the policies that shape servingness.
Saludos, HSI familia, and welcome back to the show. Today, we are learning with Luis Maldonado, who is the Vice President for Government Relations and Policy Analysis at the American Association of Colleges and Universities, or ASCU. Mr. Maldonado has more than 28 years of combined experience in government relations and advocacy efforts with various organizations in Washington, D.C., including HACU, the Council on Foundations, and the American Diabetes Association. Over his 9 years with HACU, he was the principal advocate for HSIs in Washington, D.C. In that time, he successfully established in law the federal authorization to create two important funding programs directed exclusively at HSIs, including the Department of Education's Promoting Postbaccalaureate Opportunities for Hispanic Americans, also known as Title V Part B, and the Improving Undergraduate STEM Education HSI Grant Program at the National Science Foundation. He also secured multi-million appropriations for all HSI programs across federal departments and agencies. Mr. Maldonado has a master's degree from the University of Puerto Rico Medical Sciences campus and a bachelor's degree from the University of Maryland at College Park. I invited Luis to join us today so we can talk about federal HSI policy and the implications of the 2024 election on HSIs and our collective work to advance servingness. Luis, thank you for joining us on ¿Qué pasa? HSIs, where we talk about all things HSIs. But first, we're going to talk about you. So let's go ahead and start with the very first question, which is always the servingness journey. Tell us about your servingness journey.
Thank you, Gina. It's really a pleasure to be part of this conversation. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity. My journey of servingness really started with the original intent of that word. In terms of the example that my parents showed us growing up and the need to serve community. That really led my interest in wanting to work at a hospital, because hospitals by definition have a service community. And, I learned that in school. I was ready for that. And my first job right out of graduate school was working for the governor of Puerto Rico's Washington office. And I thought that was going to be a 2-year stint, turned into 5, because I was very interested in the work that we were doing in policy, helping Puerto Rico. But it was not only after that job that I looked back and was able to really grasp that a hospital has a service community. But when you work in public policy, your community immediately becomes the entire country. And that really, really intrigued me. And I was able to turn that into a career, and it really has been fulfilling. It has allowed me to do a lot of fantastic work, and it's been a lot of fun. I think I would have enjoyed working at a hospital, but it's nowhere near, I'm sure, what public policy has provided me. I am a graduate of an HSI, the University of Puerto Rico Medical Sciences campus. I have a master's in hospital administration from the School of Public Health. So I did not know about HSIs when I was in that institution. It was only after I joined HACU, the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities, for the first time in 2002. And I did a 3-year stint there. And then I left because I was very curious about, what else I can learn in this journey. And then I came back 9 years later in 2014. And served another 5 years, so plus. So I was there collectively about 9 years, and I've loved the experience. I've been at ASCU 5 years now, and I still miss the excitement and the involvement in HACU. But we all move to newer and bigger things.
Excellent. I love it. Love to hear it. Oh yes. Ooh, that could be a whole nother episode on Puerto Rican HSIs and whether or not anybody knows it's an HSI, right? Like it's just the way of being.
They're all Hispanic. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just the way of being versus we're spending so much time actively thinking about it, right? Like on the mainland side, right? Of like, how do we do this? So
correct,
yeah, that's a whole nother episode in itself. So let's talk. You mentioned HACU. Let's talk about your role at HACU, serving in government relations and advocating for two essential grant programs that many of our listeners are either aware of, have applied for, or might be currently directing, which is the Department of Education's Title V Part B program and also NSF's HSI grant program. Tell us about that work.
It really, I think it's a very interesting journey. I've learned to describe my work as recognizing that there's no degree in lobbying. You can study a lot of things that can be applied to lobbying, but you can't go to college and say, I'm going to be a lobbyist and I'm going to study this degree. So you have to sort of learn it on the job. You have to be exposed to it. And once I fell into that line of work, over the years, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this chosen profession of mine and the challenges and the satisfactions that it provides. And I really have come to think of my work as these two independent lines that are floating in the sphere and the wind in Washington, D.C. And I call one of the lines the big P, or politics. The blue, the red, the donkey, the elephant, the conservative, the liberal, the right, the left, whatever you want to call it, that's one line. And then there's an independent separate line that I call the little p. And the little p stands for public policy. And for me, that is finding solutions to difficult problems. And my job as an advocate / lobbyist, because those are separate sides of the same coin, my job is to try to push the public policy line to find a way to intersect the political line. My experience has also taught me that it rarely ever crosses at the ideal, best possible solution. It's whatever the politics of the day allow the solution to be. The process of creating the authorization for these two new programs was a huge undertaking independently. I worked on Part B the first time I was at HACU, and then I was able to accomplish the NSF authorization my second stint. What's curious about how those two things connect is that when I left HACU the first time, they were just starting to make the case about NSF. And 9 years later, I come back to the organization. My old boss had retired, so I took his job in DC. And I was stunned to find out that the NSF grant program had still not been achieved. And I took it upon myself that I really honestly said to myself, this is either going to kill me or I'm going to accomplish it, because it's absurd that it took basically 11, 12 years to get that done. And there was no reason for it. But I go back to the conversation about the politic line and the public policy line and how difficult it's getting to intersect those lines, I should say. It takes a lot of immense amount of focus, determination. I have some great battle stories that I will be telling my grandkids about. It certainly has taught me a lot about the patience that is required, the need not to take things personally, and just the perseverance that is required. There's no question that the contributions to HSIs that I've been able to make while I was at HACU are some of the most rewarding professional accomplishments in my close to 30-year career. Every day I wonder if the work that I'm doing is in fact beneficial. Is it helping institutions? And I do so hope that it is in fact helping a lot of students well into the future. I also accepted a long time ago that I will rarely meet the people, meaning the students, that get impacted by these programs. I know they exist. I see the money going out the door, and that's good enough for me. And frankly, I have felt for a number of years now a great sense of debt that I think I have to pay back. Everyone in my family has a higher education degree. Many of them are terminal degrees. And I've now been able to pass those benefits of educational attainment to my sons. And, I choose to advocate for individuals who are seeking an opportunity to achieve the same goals that was made easier for me for not having been a first generation student. So that's what I do, and why I do it, where I do it.
Yes, you're doing servingness from the public policy space, right? If I had to put you in the servingness framework. I
Yeah.
have a question though, Claire, like with NSF, does that advocacy happen like directly with that, like them as an agency? Is that where the advocacy happened for that over this 11-year period?
So let me tell you a little bit about that, because
Yeah.
um, to this day, I am convinced that I used their own words against them to get this thing past the finish line. Let me explain. When I came back and I caught up to the issue, I was told by my colleagues and my boss at HACU about all the different ways that they had attempted to convince the NSF to do the right thing and create this program. There was no question that the program people, the folks who actually interact with the colleges and universities, understood and wanted to do something. It was the top tier leadership. They would actually get invited to to HACU conferences, and they would say, "We're not going to create a program for you. We don't think this is necessary." Frankly, the times that, for example, my old boss and I would go to the NSF, they would act like this is beneath us. We want to work with the big boys, the people who already have the labs, the people who have the PhD programs. It's not our job to help your schools catch up. That should be commerce, that should be energy, that should be the other agencies and departments. And one of the things that they attempted to do was create a program for community colleges. And they actually invented their own term, combining community colleges and HSIs. I don't remember what the term was, but I remember being infuriated that they were trying to confuse the public policy sphere, they were trying to confuse Congress, and more importantly, pretend to HSIs that they were doing something for HSIs, which was nowhere near what we were calling for. And the program really consisted on identifying community colleges, bringing the Title V folks to town, to the NSF, to meet with folks in the NSF, and to educate them, help them understand how the NSF is organized, and this is how you apply for a grant. But it was not about institutional support. It was not about building infrastructure. And I was very upset about this. Amazingly, incredibly, one afternoon, I'm in DC making a presentation at some organization, don't remember which one. And I finished, and these two women approached me. And they're like, "Luis, we wanted to meet you. We've heard about the work that you're doing. Want to say hello." "Oh, fantastic. Yeah, hey, what brings you to town?" "Oh, actually, we're over at the NSF." And I immediately connected the dot. I knew who they were and what they were doing. And I'm like, "So how is it going?" And I kid you not, this is what they tell me. They were like, "Luis, it was amazing. They invited all of the heads of the different departments at the NSF to make a presentation about who they were and what they did. And they're called directorates, these sections in the National Science Foundation. And the most important one for the purposes of infrastructure grant funding is the HR directorate. And they say, this white guy gets up to the podium and says, "Listen, I'm a white guy. I don't know who all of you are. I don't understand what you're doing here, but I've been told that I need to try to explain what I do. So here I go. I wish I had $1 for every time I told that story on the Hill. And I wish I could have recorded the vast majority, not everyone's, but the vast majority of people's reaction to hearing that story, because they've been listening to the advocacy work that HACU had been doing for not the previous 9 years without really reacting to it. They dabbled here and they forced the NSF to create a report every year and but not what was needed. I am convinced that story and the credibility that I had created on behalf of HACU and the HSIs, people just believed me. And I am convinced that that's what actually got us the program at the end of the day, because they realized that the NSF was not going to do what we already had made clearly plain, that we needed to develop the infrastructure at HSIs if we were serious about diversifying not only the professorate, but the researchers and the people who acquire PhDs and the people who do research. It was just a glorious day when that vote occurred and that program was cemented there into eternity. And it's doing fantastic. I hear over the years since that happened about the fantastic work that the frontline people at NSF are doing with HSIs and how much the program has grown. And it's just, frankly, very satisfying.
Thank you for the story, because that really gives us a perspective on like the timing, the patience, the right people, right? That comes into play for public policy to actually come into play, right? Like to really happen.
And without advocacy, there's no policy. At least not the one you expect to get, because they might do something, but it might be half-assed. It might be a completely different intersection of the lines that you're not happy with. I've come to learn that our system of government requires an active citizenry. It is impossible for legislators or their staff to know everything about everything. They need perspective. They need data. They need inspiration. They need political perspective, and the cover to be courageous. Because that is what's missing more than anything in developing much needed and overdue policy improvements in higher education today. The current version of the Higher Education Act was last updated 16 years ago and counting. It does not reflect the current conditions and the type of students who now represent the majority in higher education. And that has a great impact in not just the Hispanics, but every student of color, every first generation, every low-income student, every part-timer, every veteran, every adult learner, every person who stopped out and came back. The policies right now do not really support their educational attainment, and that's why we need to continue pushing for an actual reauthorization that takes these into account. And the needs of HSIs is an important part of that.
Yes, for sure. And we saw President Biden just signed an executive order, right, to elevate HSIs, and that's going to be interesting to see how that gets like moved into different spaces, right? Which we'll get to. But I want to ask you, building off of what you just said, I think a lot about my role as a researcher in that I do all this research. And in like journal articles, I write like an implications for policy section that I feel like probably never actually makes it to the right policy people, right? Like, does anybody actually read that? So a question I have selfishly as a researcher who I want to impact policy, like what can we do to make sure that our research does get into the right hands, right? The people that are, because like you said, the advocacy piece is key. So that means we need to get it to the folks who are doing the advocacy work, right? So what are some things we can do, right, as researchers to better influence policy?
One of the things that is important to recognize is that practitioners are in the front lines of what's working and what is not working. They have a great perspective on what's happening and have a very useful insight on what's needed by the institutions and for the students. That's very valuable for people like me in the trenches of the little P, the public policy trenches. They have a great insight, as I was saying, to those institutions. I have to do a shout out to my old friends and colleagues at ASI, the Alliance for Hispanic Survey Institutions Educators, because they always would get a kick when I would say, there's an adage in DC, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Meaning, if you're not part of the conversation or the debate, your piece of the pie is being given to someone else. You lose your fair share of what you think you deserve. I would encourage listeners to join a professional association. They are all connected to some sort of advocacy effort. That is one of the main reasons associations exist. They will help you learn how to be an advocate or be a better advocate if you already have some experience. I would encourage you to talk to your government relations staff on campus. Alert them of the relevant research, the experiences, the challenges that you're facing that you've seen that can help illuminate policy issue or a question. The GR folks may help elevate, share that data, that insight with policymakers and or staff in their work. I'll give you an example. One of the things we've done at the American Association of Psychologists and Universities, or ASCU, as we call it, along with other organizations, is to support the Department of Education's request that a small portion of each of the federal grant programs at the department in higher ed goes to colleges and universities, with a few exceptions related to student aid and HBCUs, be taken to support the research activities on each of these programs. Right now, the department has a very weak evaluation process. We do not have real solid, consistent, well thought out impact report. People write their reports, but we don't have a macro perspective. So the department is now tapping into the source of money, and I don't know yet how they're planning to use it, how they're going to dole it out, who's going to be encouraged to do this kind of research and analysis. But I can't wait to read it and learn more about these grant programs, because they should illuminate all kinds of opportunities, but it should also highlight the amazing work that so many Title V directors are doing in those institutions.
Okay, let's hope they tap me. That's always like me, pick me.
So
happy to do that work.
keep your eye out on the most likely the Federal Register. And I haven't come across anything yet, but I have every intention of spreading the word when I finally see these things, because hopefully it will not only encourage the folks that are already doing it, but will attract more people into researching the impacts of Title III and Title V programs.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's so much impact and we don't write about it. Like very few people are writing about that exact thing, right? Like we're as a researcher, like I say, we go in with our own ideas of things we want to study, and it's not necessarily the actual impact of the work, right? Very few people actually are doing that work. I have a whole book, an edited book, that was the intention, right? Was like, let's let the Title V and Title III directors tell us what they're doing, right? Which was an interesting process because they're busy doing the thing. That it was, I really guided a lot of that process because I'm like, okay, let's get your stories written down, right? Let's get people reading them. But yeah, that's really interesting because we need more stories, right? The stories, and some of it, honestly, this podcast, that's where the podcast came from. A way to get stories, right? We're storytelling on this podcast, and there are people that come on and talk about the work they're doing with their Title V and Title III dollars that they never write it down either, right? But they share it,
And that certainly has its place, because it's important to look at the individual grant program and the lessons learned, etc. But we also, which I think is missing, is the macro perspective in terms of this is an entire federal program. What is that? What has it accomplished? What's missing? What needs to be adapted? What needs to be updated? What needs to be changed? How does this compare to other programs? And I understand that it should not be intended to rank programs, but to cross-pollinate. We are very aware about the diversity of Hispanic serving institutions and the number of African American students and Asian Pacific Islander students, etc. How does that compare to an ANAPC grant? How does that compare to a PBI grant? What lessons can be cross-pollinated? So I hope that these funds that the department had been seeking and Congress would not allocate, they decided that we need to get it from the money that has been allocated for the programs. And frankly, I thought about that for a while in terms of the policy implications of it, but I really landed on the side of this is certainly needed. It's just under 1%. It's good medicine for all of us, because how else are we going to learn about the good work. And I have faith that it's really going to be able to illustrate in clear terms the impact that these programs are having across the board, which hopefully will lead to improvements in the program and additional resources at the end of the day.
Yes. Okay, you just mapped out a whole research agenda for me and my HSI Research Colectiva, which there's a group of us who are trying to pull, together to like, what is the research that needs to happen on HSIs, right? What do we need to know? So that, like, yeah, you're giving me lots of ideas for us to think about.
Fantastic. I will be a happy consumer of that research.
Okay, awesome. So you mentioned funding a couple times, and I wanted to talk about funding because, as we know, funding has been steady, and we're thankful for that, right? And has come in these different ways. Title 5B comes in, NSF comes in, right? Like there's different funding streams that are coming in, yet it hasn't kept pace with the number, right? We're all like at what, 600 now HSIs. So what are your thoughts on that as far as like, how do we keep advocating for more funding? Because I think we are getting worried that like it's getting too hard, it's getting too competitive to even get it, and we're going to keep seeing an increase in HSI. So, what are your thoughts on that?
There are two distinct groups in Congress that are the key to that process. The first ones are the authorizers, and I have come to describe this as the authorization process is like going to a bank and opening a checking account. And then the appropriations process, which is its own entity on the Hill, is like putting money into the checking account so you can write a check against it. So creating, for example, the authorization for Title V Part B is an authorization process, but you're halfway there. Then you have to fight the money fight to actually put money into that checking account. And every single federal program basically works that way. So when we're talking about HSI funding, we have to make sure that it's an authorized program. And then what we're talking about is engaging and doing direct advocacy and engagement with the funders, meaning the policymakers in charge of allocating funding. They are the ones who run the table where the menu is being served and things get allocated. So when we talk about, you're either on the table or on the menu, those are the folks that we're talking about. We have to realize that they do not fund out of the goodness of their hearts. These are people who care. These are very smart people, capable people. There are a lot of positive characteristics. But what they do in response to increased advocacy and hearing many squeaking wheels. They have to understand how the issue relates to either their own district if they're in the House or their state if they're in the Senate. And then the Senate tends to have a more national perspective. I mean, that's just inculcated into the whole Senate structure. So depending on who you're speaking with, which side of the aisle, which side of the Capitol, you can never change your goal. You can never change the way you describe things, but you might use different terms, you might use different examples. But at the end of the day, it requires a fight. There are plenty of other groups that are working to take home your lunch money. You have to engage them. That's the only way they're going to do it. They're not going to just you're not going to review the list of authorized programs and say, oh, this has no dollars, or it has only $5. Let me give it another 10. It doesn't work that way. You have to show up. You have to make the case as to why it's important. It is important to also acknowledge that historically speaking, the programs in Title III and Title V are easily pitted against each other when the different groups come to advocate. And I know that over the years, there has been an understanding of these groups within Title III and Title V that we're better off working together, not separately against each other, not only to make the case for each of our programs, but that the nation needs to make a new investment. There are more resources that all of these programs need because as we know, the only growing component of enrollment in higher education are students of color. And that will continue to be the case. And these programs, of course, are designed to help those institutions that enroll the largest percentage of those students. But every single one of them is underfunded compared to the need, not just of yesterday, not just of today, but we already know of tomorrow. Advocacy is about engaging those individuals so that they understand, so they have a better perspective, so that they're motivated and they understand why these investments are necessary. It's not an easy process. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. But that's what people like me, and as I call them, my co-conspirators in DC, that's why we're in this fight. I know it fuels my passion and my dedication to it, and I enjoy it. The last thing I'll say, because it is an election year after all, you have to choose. Vote for the elected officials that represent your values, your priorities, and what you want to accomplish. It's really that simple. If more of us do that, I think we'll end up with better policy solutions to an increasingly difficult public policy road.
Wow. You got me thinking about so many things. This feels like a master class on public policy for me. I'm like, ooh, I need to be taking notes. I'm going to rewind and take notes for sure.
Well,
because
I'm brain dumping almost 30 years of experience here.
Yes. I hope there's people listening, grad students, like undergrads that are like, I want to go into this work, right? Like you're really making a strong case about why the work that you do is so important, right? Because and you do it in such an interesting way about like, if you're not, at the table, you're on the table, right? That we can understand. That's pretty powerful analogy. So
I think people in DC over the years have come up with these adages, these sayings to explain a lot in a very short, concise way. But the truth is, as corny as they sound, they are so spot on. They're so true. So that's why we use them, because we certainly understand what's behind them. And I think they're easy to understand, generally.
Yeah, for sure. So I was going to ask you about the election. I think you already answered it, but I would love to give you more space to talk about it, because I think it's such an important thing for us to think about. How do we become informed voters, right? Like on the issues we care about, right? And for listeners on this podcast, we care about HSIs, we care about funding, we care about supporting minoritized students. But I think also something for us to think about is like the federal elections versus the state elections. Because I'm seeing like HSIs struggle in states where they're not very supportive, right? As we know, the research shows that there's a strong correlation between the political affiliation of the governor's office, right? And then therefore everything trickles down, particularly state governing boards then are then appointed by those governors, right? So the states where it's we'll just say more red, the big P is more red, right? Or more conservative, are starting to really struggle with this HSI. How do we do HSI in these states? So any thoughts on that, right? Even in this distinction between the different kinds of elections and how we become good consumers of information before we vote.
Well, the first thing I'll say in response to that is, I work for a nonprofit. I work for a non-political entity. I work in a bipartisan environment, and I think it's very important for me to maintain that posture as an employee of HACU. But I think it has also served me well in my role over the years, because my job is to work with whomever's in the chair, regardless of who that person is, he or she. And his or her politics, until they sit in the chair, I may have a personal opinion about it. I do not have a professional opinion about it, other than it helps inform how I approach the advocacy work that I have to do with that individual and what he or she believes in. So I wanted to sort of put that on the table. HACU represents public four-year institutions. There's 517 what we call regional public universities, RPUs, which is actually a relatively new term that HACU has adopted to positively define who we are. historically ask you, you should define our sector of institutions by saying what we're not. We're not that. We're not that. We're in the middle. So now we're taking a different posture. We're saying we are RPUs. These are the impacts that we have. And we're very sensitive. We're certainly very aware as state entities that these universities are, how they are impacted by state legislatures. And I mean, that is really the large democratic experiment that is the United States. We have a central federal government, and then we have 50 different laboratories of policy solutions to difficult problems. And right now, everyone is struggling. As an example, what is happening with DEI offices in campuses, depending on the state you are. After the Dobbs decision came down from the Supreme Court, what does this mean for reproductive services on campus? Again, depending on which state you live in. So ASCU is trying to wrap its head in what is the best way of serving our institutions across states when these policy issues are getting dicey by the day. I also acknowledge that this is an election year. A lot is on the table. So we have to go through the electoral process. We have to see what the outcome of the election is. We have to see how the dust settles eventually. And then we'll hear what they actually care about. What are the things that are actually on the table, both at the federal level and at the state level? And then advocates react. They engage every 2 years in Washington. We have to restart our efforts because one Congress cannot commit another. So any bill that got introduced this Congress, the last 2 years, doesn't get signed into law, would have to be reintroduced in the coming year afresh because it will be a completely new Congress. So that is, I mean, that's just how the Constitution determines it. And that's just how the sausage is made.
Yes, 50 labs. That's an interesting way to think about it.
It's not my original thought. It's not my original thought, but I learned it a long time ago, and I certainly understand how it plays out.
Yeah, it is. It's 50 different states doing 50 different things. So by Constitution, that's helpful. Even just your initial response about like the kind of work that y'all do, right? Like this nonpartisan work, I think is important for our listeners to think about being aware of where you're consuming information, because not all organizations would say that, right? Like what kind of you know, things that they're representing and sort of which way they're leaning in the big P world. It varies, right? And
sort of to that point, Gina, I live in the small P world, but I have to study, I have to observe, I have to follow, I have to understand the political world, because that's the only way we're going to see how the lines might intersect at the end of the day. We have to understand the opportunities, the political opportunities, what the political winds are providing us as it relates to opportunities, that they show us what their priorities are, when we might have an easier path to getting things done. I mean, that's why it took, even back then, the development, the authorization for the Part B program took, at the end of the day, 5.5 years to actually get signed into law. The first stint I was HACU, I was there 3 years. I got it placed in the Senate bill. I got it placed in the House bill. They each voted, they approved them, but they never got together to clear one bill that then they could get to the president's desk. So when I left, the person who sort of took over my portfolio forever after would tell me, Luis, you did me the greatest favor. I don't have to fight for anything. My job is just protect what you put in the bill. And then eventually it got signed, but it was 2 Congresses later. And that was a long time. I already shared the story about NSF and how that took almost 12 years
Mm-hmm.
Today, any campaign of any major significance
Mm-hmm.
takes much longer. Not everybody's built for that fight. Something today, and I mean, FAFSA simplification and the application by the department, all the challenges that brought. Chairman of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, also known as the HELP Committee. It was his dream. Year after year, he kept fighting. He was the chair. He couldn't get it done. And it was only after we announced his retirement, he was going out the door, that actually everybody got together and said, we need to do FAFSA simplification. And he was able to do it literally on the way out. So the time it takes to actually do these things, that's why HEA is on year 16. It's not getting any easier to complete reauthorization. But for people like me, the fight is what matters, not how long it's going to take.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Oof. That part right there. Not everybody's built for it, huh? Clearly you are.
Not everybody. So as it turns out, I am. I enjoy it. It has a great time. I have a great time doing it. The wins are few and far in between. But when you get one, it stays with you a while. And this is a God honest true story. I always regret it that I left HACU when I did the first time, because I was never around to fight for the first dollar of the Part B program, which is, by the way, the hardest dollar to get in Washington ever, is the first dollar of a new program. So HACU clearly had capable people, and there was a lot, at the end of the day, there was a lot of support for this program. That's why it got enacted, and people realized we need to fund it. Of course, the original funding of the program was a miserable number. But at the end of the day, the first dollar is the hardest. This is all to say that I was working at my new organization at that time, and by chance, I came across an announcement that the first grants had been issued for Part B. And I very excitedly researched the institutions. And when I saw that list, I swear to you, a tear came down my cheek of understanding the impact that, oh my God, that all that effort took to know that these institutions were now going to have more resources to do the fabulous work of Part B was a very emotional moment for sure.
Wow, that's so
and
powerful.
That stays with you. It just gives you the fuel you need to move forward. And the NSF, 12 years later, became the next fuel cell. And this is how you accumulate the perseverance that you need.
Wow, so powerful. And you're like humanizing this process, right? Because those of us that are not in it, right, in that fight directly, it doesn't, it's hard to understand, right? Like how directly connected people become, right? People like you doing this advocacy work. So
I've come to learn that old video of Schoolhouse Rock about I am a bill, etc.
Yes.
I mean, it's as simple as it can get, but it has lulled us into this sense of that's such an easy process, and it's so normal, and everybody's so happy, and everybody sings through the process. No, I describe it as a full contact sport, and you have to show up to play.
Yes.
And you have to sometimes play through the pain.
That part. Well, let's continue down this line about us thinking about the election and things for us to consider. One big thing that people are talking about is this Project 2025, right? And this like extensive document that outlines what could happen if we return to a Republican administration. And so, some of us are fearful, things like, will the Department of Ed go away? Does that mean Title V goes away? Things like that. So what are things we can consider about Project 2025 as we're thinking about this election?
To really answer that question, let me go back and tell you a different story, because I learned a very important lesson through this. when President Trump was in his first year of his term. Every president has to submit a budget request to Congress. That happens every year. So when that happens, historically, traditionally, the Department of Education holds a briefing. And the Secretary of Education comes, gives a speech, and the head of the higher ed group comes and gives a speech. The elementary, secondary people come, and they present the budget. They tell you about what they're doing and what the policy goals are and the implications on funding, etc. So it's a tradition. We get our little budget book, which is a great tool that serves us over the years to see the historical trends of what the president's request for funding for each and every single education program is. So I show up for this grant, so this budget briefing, as I do most years, and I open the book and I start to read, and the Department of Education was requesting that Congress block grant all Title III and V programs into one program, except the HBCU program and the tribal colleges program. And if history has taught me anything, is that when you block grant a program, that means you're cutting funding for it. They do not grow independently. They would have gotten rid of the real expertise that exists in the staff for each of those grant programs. So I was infuriated. I was steaming, sitting there, waiting for my chance, when during the session, because they do it every year, there are mics in the hallway, in the alleyway between the seats, and they open it up for questions. And I got up. I did not have a question, but I nailed them about what a bad policy that was, how ill-conceived it was, and I started spewing data about the growth of HSIs, the importance of Hispanic students, and frankly, students of color, for the future economic development of this country, and yada, yada, yada. I sit down, and everybody, goes on with their questions, and it was not only after the event ended that I ran into my old colleague at HACU, the one who said to me, "Oh, Luis, you made it so easy for me. I just had to defend what you had done." He happens to have been sitting all the way back in the briefing room, right in front of the political people at the department. And he tells me, "Luis, very well said. I'm glad you spoke up, etc." And he says, "I have to tell you something." I said, "I was listening to the political people in the back of the room, and I heard, and I'm not going to say this person's name because I want to protect the person, said, we're going to have a problem with HSIs."
Uh-oh.
And incredibly, I am not lying, incredibly, around that time, we were planning at HACU for the Capital Forum, which is sort of the Hill Day for HACU, for the members of HACU. And I had been trying to get somebody from the department to come and speak. Can you believe that by the time it took me to get from that conference room to my office at HACU's office in DC, I had received an email, the person from the department accepting my invitation for them to come and speak at the event. So I tell this story because I immediately started contacting my network of champions on the Hill, and every single one of them said to me, "Luis, we saw the proposal. Actually, on both sides of the aisle, we saw the proposal. Don't worry, we're never going to act on this." And every year, Trump put forward a budget request. That same idea was put forward. And after that first year and all the work I did to make sure that our people were in place to support it, I never bothered to ask or say anything else because I knew the people in the program and the people and the programs were safe, that this turned out to be more of a big P political statement as opposed to real policy. And I'm not disputing that there are, in fact, people who would have loved to have done that. But the political process requires those two lines to intersect. And as long as you keep the policy people informed, engaged, interested, and committed, you're going to survive more things than not. I say this because Project 2025 is full of things that make you wonder, oh my goodness, what does this mean for HSIs? What does it mean for other MSIs? What does it mean for the students and those communities? It's worth noting that one of the things that has gotten the most attention is the proposal to shut down the Department of Education. We have to take into consideration that this proposal is not new. It has been part of the partisan politics in Washington since Jimmy Carter created the Department of Education in 1979. And it's actually worth noting that in 1867, President Andrew Johnson actually created the first iteration of the Department of Education. It only lasted 1 year. So it's proof that the politics of education policy have been around a long time. But since 1979, right? Have you ever stopped to wonder, why hasn't it happened already? Think of the big P and the little p. That process needs to happen in order for this to actually occur. Sometimes the big P, the politics, just wants to float around and never intersect the little p of public policy. Because there are advantages to having that talking point, that idea makes some people, feel warm and fuzzy inside, but in reality, it's just never going to happen. The truth is, I don't lose sleep over that specific proposal in Project 2025. I also acknowledge that I try not to get ahead of myself or the process. Things have to happen well in advance for it actually to become even a possibility. Forget a probability. People need to read Project 2025. They need to be aware of the proposals it contains, and then decide whether you want to empower the people to make it a reality. Every single voter in this country not only has the opportunity to do that, I would argue you have a responsibility to do that. I personally don't believe it will ever happen. And I hope I'm not wrong. And I can hear the voices in my head of people listening to this right now and say, but what about the recent Supreme Court decisions that have overturned rulings that seem secured? I would say there are stark differences among those things, politically speaking. For example, Roe versus Wade was never a law. It was an opinion by the Supreme Court of the United States. Opinions can and do frequently change, particularly in the political arena. Laws are much harder, especially in the recent political climate, to change. I'll say it again, HEA, 16 years and counting. Besides, at the end of the day, it will take 60 votes in the Senate to even get to the debate about stopping or doing away with the Department of Education. It's just never going to happen.
Yes.
There are not 60 votes in the Senate to accomplish that. At least not today. We'll see. Every 2 years, we reshuffle ourselves. We'll have to see what the outcome of November is. And if you think, well, based on what I just shared, oh, that will never happen. It will never happen under the current circumstances. The outcome of the election can change that, but that's up to us. Every 2 years, we go through the same process nationally. And I'll remind you of another saying. Our system of government is the worst that has ever been created, except for every other one that has been tried. So it's not perfect, but it's the best one we have so far. And we have to live under the rules of that. So we have to vote. We have to be part of the process. We have to advocate. We have to be informed. Otherwise, bad policies get inserted.
Oh, yes, 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 yes. Thank you for that very extensive answer. Helps ease my heart a little bit. Hopefully some of our listeners to understand the deeper ways that policy becomes policy. I think that's what you're helping us here, right? So much so I'm thinking, ooh, my higher ed policy classes, this is going to be a required episode, right? Because it's just, you're really helping us understand the process that we don't always all necessarily understand when it's not our work. We just hear the fear and whatnot that comes out, it's coming up right now. So,
yeah.
So thank you for that. One more thing I wanted to ask you about is something I talk a lot about with HSIs is that they shouldn't only rely on the Department of Ed and the NSF, the Title V, Title IIIs, and or only think about that one policy, right? The Higher Ed Act, let's say, affecting them, that there are other policies that also either help or hinder our ability to fully serve our students, right? Things like Pell Grant, right? Policy around Pell Grants, DREAM Acts, right? State DREAM Acts, anti-DEI legislation, DEI legislation, those sort of things could impact our work as well. It doesn't have to be big HSI, policy only. So what are some of the things that y'all are working on at ASCU that could potentially affect HSIs, right? That has an impact, and particularly several of your campuses, right? Your partner campuses that y'all work with are HSIs. So talk to us about any other things, right? That y'all are advocating for now that we can think about beyond the just general HSI kind of stuff we think about.
Happy to do so. Let me share a little bit about our sector of schools to really answer your question. I've mentioned there's 517 regional public universities, RPUs. 177 of them meet the eligibility requirements to apply for federal designation and funding for at least one MSI category. As you know, there's a lot of overlaps between HSIs and NAPCs, and that number is only going to increase. In looking at the demographics and trends in the creation of HSIs, we know that that number will continue to rise just like NAPCs. The number of HSIs and NAPCs will continue to grow, and others too, but not at the rate that HSIs and NAPCs will continue to do so. Amongst all public four-year colleges and universities, RPUs enroll 79% of all Hispanics in undergraduate programs, 87% of all Black students, 71% of all American Indian or Alaska Native, 68% of all Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islanders, 59% of all Asian students in undergraduate four-year institutions. That just gives you a sense of the makeup of our institutions. RPUs award 67% of all bachelor's degrees and 68% of all master's degrees earned at public four-year institutions. We are very focused on those institutions that disproportionately enroll students of color, low income, first generation, part-timers, adult learners, veterans, transfers, students that stop and come back to higher education. Our policy priorities reflect the policy needs of these individuals and the institutions that serve them. We support efforts that improve access, retention, because we don't talk enough about retention, and success for these students. Retention is a very high priority for ASCU, because if we don't keep the students that are coming through our doors, we're never going to get a success, which is the ultimate goal. So I say this because we have a plethora of things that we care about, but the three that I would like to highlight is we support the effort to double Pell to $13,000 a year. We need to recoup a lot of the purchasing power that has been lost since the program was created. When it paid in 1990, it paid for over 80% of the cost of an undergraduate degree, whereas now it's under 30%. We need to recoup that purchasing power. That will alleviate a lot of the pressure on student loans and focus more on the grants that do not have to be repaid and actually do more to support those students. We believe that we need to strengthen the federal-state partnership. to encourage states to continue to invest in public higher education with an influx of federal resources. That is the most cost-effective way to actually make a higher education degree affordable. Investing in the institutions to give them the resources and the tools they need to serve those students. And because at ASCU, one of the common threads among our membership is that most of them started as normal schools. That old term for schools of education, the entities that were creating the teachers in hundreds of communities across the country. And as those small towns grew into cities and they became larger, the economic development needs of that region required more prepared professionals. So these so-called normal schools grew up to be full-fledged colleges and universities. And that's why educator preparation programs continues to be a high priority for us. Twofold. We need to strengthen schools of education, and we must diversify the teaching core. The rarest teacher in America today is a Black male. But the biggest gap exists between Hispanic students and Hispanic teachers. We need to correct both of those things, and investing directly into schools of education, particularly at minority serving institutions like HSIs, is a smart policy, if you ask me. So I couldn't possibly name everything that is on our plate, but the vast majority of these policies impact HSIs, but it's not because they are HSIs, it's because they're a college or a university. And that's part of the reason I enjoy my job so much. And I get to not only help HSIs, but I get to help HBCUs, ANAPCs, SANTIs, PBIs, HSIs. I mean, professionally speaking, it's very gratifying.
Yes. And that's like why I talk about that, right? And you just put an exclamation point on it. It's like, it's not only the organizations that have HSI in their title, like HACU, right, or HACU, right, that we all know, obviously advocating for HSI, is that like a lot of the policy intermediaries are doing a lot of the advocacy work that is ultimately impacting, right, HSIs, or like you say, MSIs, right, the vast majority of MSIs. So Thank you for that. So this has been a beautiful conversation. It's one of those that I hope people listen all the way to the end because it's such good information. You've provided us so much. But we got to get to the final question. Final question is the name of the show. ¿Qué pasa, HSIs? When you hear that, what's your response? ¿Qué pasa, HSIs?
So two things really come to mind. One of them is, well, actually, maybe three. When I was at HACU, and it really has stayed with me, I frequently would go on the Hill and tell people, I mean, seriously tell people, there's only two types of institutions, HSIs and not one yet. So
yes, me too.
When I talk to HSIs, to everyone at an HSI today, keep doing what you're doing. Your efforts directly or indirectly are changing lives, whole families, and entire communities. And I'll close by saying, a lot of people say, sí se puede. My version of that is, se tiene que hacer. It has to get done. And that's why I love what I do. It has to get done.
Beautiful, authentic response. Thank you, Luis, for being here with us today on ¿Qué pasa, HSIs?
Very grateful for the invitation, Gina. Thank you so much.